So thank you for that introduction. I'll give you some quick context on who we are as a company. The project that I'm here to speak about today is a project we're working on called Aion. But maybe a quick background before I get there. It was mentioned briefly that we've done a lot of work in the enterprise space. So I started in 2014. I started the first blockchain team at Deloitte in the world, focused on what the enterprise implications of distributed systems would be. We ran that for about 2 years, before at which point I left Deloitte to start a company called Nuco, still focused on the enterprise market, still focused on how do we build infrastructure to allow these large incumbents to move into this space. What we realized, I think, in the process of doing that is two things. One, the infrastructure was nowhere near ready for the type of scale and reality that these big incumbents needed. And two, these incumbents were not ready for this technology. So we started asking questions around what core pieces of infrastructure were missing, and we started focusing on a particular layer of infrastructure that I'm going to talk to you about today around scale and interoperability between blockchains. And this is the project that we're focusing on most recently called Aion. So the Aion network is a public blockchain. I don't know if my slides are, there you go. So the Aion network is a public blockchain that focuses predominantly on a system that can be applied in both private and public settings, a system that can be used to connect other systems to each other, and a system that can be used to achieve greater scale as public systems and private systems together. So to give you a little bit of background on how we got to this problem statement, when we were working on a lot of these enterprise use cases over the last 4 years, we realized that the same kind of repeated themes came up. Transaction throughput, scale of data, and then more and more, what was going to be at the edges of these consortium private networks as we built them for groups of banks, groups of government entities, et cetera, et cetera. At some point, you ended up realizing that your blockchain was limited by its participants, and you would have to make a jump from one network to another network, and nobody had asked the question of how do you make those connections exist. I know earlier today we saw a presentation by Ripple and the Interledger protocol team. There's a lot of really interesting applications and research being done on this concept of interoperability. So we started to think about it a little bit more from a wholesome perspective as to what are the big pieces of infrastructure being built in the market today, and how could we bring them all together. So if you were to summarize historically and more recently the three kind of big buckets of infrastructure where we've seen a lot of projects, we've seen projects in the private enterprise space, so projects that you might be familiar with like R3's Corda, the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance that we're still very heavily involved in, Hyperledger being led by the Linux Foundation and IBM predominantly. All of these private systems focusing on that enterprise market specifically. In parallel to that, and almost on the opposite end of the spectrum, the blockchain versus cryptocurrency debate, you had Bitcoin, Ethereum, and dozens of other protocols emerging over the course, specifically of the last 12 months if you've followed the ICO market. And now more recently, projects focusing on interoperability. Protocols that are trying to position themselves as kind of the TCP/IP infrastructure that's going to bring all these dots together and connect us all in one giant ecosystem. So instead of thinking of these as individual infrastructure requirements, we started to think about how could we build a design that actually encompasses these three things in a single network. So a system that could be applied as a private chain as well as a public chain, a system that could achieve greater scale, and a system that could natively connect not only sub-networks of its own DNA, but also other networks that are of different designs, networks like Ethereum and Bitcoin and Hyperledger and others. So with that in mind, we started putting some effort into Aion. And a little background on the Aion project, we kind of announced our intention to do this last March. We published our first white paper on this in July of last year, raised money throughout the fall, and we've been kind of developing the first release, which is currently in an open test beta. So if there's any developers in the room, there's a lot of interesting stuff to kind of look at online as to what we're building. But the intention of Aion was to do three primary functions, and we call these federate, scale, and spoke. And what that means from our perspective is the ability to look at transactions and applications and detach them from single networks. So from an application developer's perspective, today you almost have this concept of vendor lock-in in the industry, where if you're an Ethereum app developer, you're locked into the Ethereum ecosystem. If you're a Bitcoin developer, you're locked into the Bitcoin ecosystem, and et cetera, as more protocols develop. Where we realize that in other industries other than crypto, that's not how application development works. People are not tied to the infrastructure that they're building their app on. They could very easily pick up their app off of Amazon Web Services and redeploy it on top of Google or on top of Microsoft Azure or whatever they might need in terms of underpinning infrastructure. So how do you obfuscate from the application developer's perspective where they're sitting? How do you allow transactions to federate, meaning move across networks seamlessly without going through centralized intermediaries? How do you allow applications to build logic that is tied into more than one blockchain? And how do you allow networks to be birthed out of this network? So we kind of look at this as a hub and spoke model, where I can use a hub network to create new blockchains as scale requirements pop up. So this was kind of the guiding design behind what we were trying to accomplish when we launched the Aion project. So with that in mind, here's a very brief look at, kind of a zoom-in view of what the network infrastructure looks like. There's kind of two analogies that we talked about when we think about Aion and what its function is in this network, or three analogies, I should say. One, it's a little bit of a TCP/IP style communication protocol that allows you to move messages between blockchains. Two, it's an operating system, meaning you can use this system to build applications and to run completely decentralized apps that are connected to multiple blockchains. And three, it acts as a router for other networks to find each other in a network of many blockchains, or the decentralized internet that we see the world turning into as we move down this path. So if you look at this diagram very quickly, the center of this network is what we're calling the Aion blockchain. And the Aion blockchain, as the name implies, is a public, open source, decentralized network. It acts as a function of being a decentralized home for operating system type execution, so building applications, but also acts as a registry system for other networks to connect to. So what that looks like is we build these functions we call bridges, illustrated here kind of with these dotted lines. Bridges being the communication layer that allows me to send a message between one blockchain and another and recognize that an event is taking place somewhere else and use that event as a trigger to a new transaction on a new blockchain, if that makes sense. So what's very, very difficult in the industry today is to look at applications as being cross-blockchain without centralizing any of that application logic. So how can you say, if this happens on blockchain number one, then trigger this on blockchain number two? That type of decentralized logic doesn't exist in today's infrastructure. So the irony of our industry, if you're in the crypto space, is that all of this talk of decentralization, and we all put tons and tons and tons of value and weight behind centralized institutions like exchanges. So we've all just kind of recreated the financial institutions of the old industry into our new industry. So can we replace these things with decentralized protocols that allow us to prove transactions' validity and authenticity across chains? So that's the purpose of these bridges. On the edge of the network is other blockchains that could either be existing public networks, so networks like Ethereum, networks like upcoming networks like Cardano, EOS, networks like Bitcoin. Alternatively, you've got private networks, some of the ones that we already mentioned, systems that are going to be built with regulatory considerations in mind, with geographical boundaries in mind, with very domain-specific requirements like banking, insurance, government identity, whatever the case might be around these private networks. And finally, what we call Aion spoke networks, which are essentially just duplications of the DNA of the Aion system to build a new network that connects back. What's crucial to understand in this design is that at every layer of this infrastructure, we're talking about decentralized communication. So decentralized at the routing system, decentralized at the bridge system, and decentralized at the endpoints on the network. So if you're looking at what the purpose of this network is and what do I do as a user of the Aion network, there's essentially 5 types of interactions that we anticipate with the Aion system. So you're either a developer in the top row or a business builder in the top row, or you're an infrastructure provider in the bottom row. If you're a developer, we kind of bucket these into 3 different categories, equally important one against the other. One is the startup. What we're noticing increasingly in the industry is that more and more established non-blockchain startups are looking at decentralized infrastructure as potentially unlocking a new set of functionalities in their business models. And they're in large numbers starting to migrate their infrastructures and architectures to decentralized architectures. And for them, it's really a matter of creating a set of familiar tools and frameworks so that they can pick up this type of new development in a relatively familiar way without too much learning curve or need for a completely new skill set. In the middle, you have the enterprise being a little bit slower, probably needing a little bit more hand-holding and a little bit more support, and building the functionalities that Red Hat would have built to Linux 20 years ago when that became kind of a standard among enterprises. And then finally, you've got the dApp developer, which is the existing application builder inside the blockchain ecosystem, and pitching them on the idea that there should not be this religious affiliation to blockchains, which kind of tends to be the case today if you follow the crypto industry, where you're really, really religiously tied to a single network, when in reality, your application's success or failure should probably not be tied to the success or failure of the infrastructure you built it on. So if you build it on the wrong blockchain, all of a sudden that blockchain loses value, your business kind of goes down with the infrastructure that you picked. So detaching that vendor lock-in from an app developer's perspective. At the infrastructure layer, we talk about 2 types of infrastructure providers. You're either a validator on these networks where you're proving the authenticity of transactions, you're providing computing resources to the system, as is the case with miners and many public systems that you'd be familiar with, or you're what we call a bridge builder, which means you're providing the infrastructure at the intersection of blockchains. infrastructure that allows you to witness events on one blockchain, make sure that everyone on the bridge is in agreement as to the reality and validity of that event, and then signal to the next blockchain what you just saw. And that's how we kind of create this routing system where at every layer, people are incentivized to behave in the best interest of the network, and they're all there kind of supporting each other in the functionalities needed to make the network operate. I'm running through this a little bit quickly because I've only got 15 minutes to get through this, but just a couple of examples of where this fits in and why we're so excited about this type of protocol. And you'll notice if you follow the industry, it's increasingly becoming a very, very hot topic. We launched something in November called the Blockchain Interoperability Alliance, which is a group of projects focused on interoperability, looking to standardize and figure out best practices for that messaging of data between networks. What's crucial to understand here when you look at different protocols, though, is there are a number of protocols looking at value transfers between blockchains. Value transfers meaning I have a token on one blockchain and I want to swap it for a token on another, and there's lots of features and functions by which you can do that. What we're trying to design is a significantly more generic layer of proving a change of state on a blockchain, either from a logical perspective or a value perspective. So if I update a smart contract to reflect my new address on my driver's license, for example, I've changed the state of the blockchain and I want to be able to recognize that as a transaction, even though no value has changed hands. So, thinking about it at that layer starts to allow you to think about the types of use cases that you can build. So it might be decentralized exchanges for coins and tokens, which is absolutely a hot topic today in the industry, but it might also be use cases that are hybrid public and private blockchains. So one of the examples we often talk about is imagine a healthcare network of hospitals sharing patient medical information on a private network. And I get an operation, therefore my medical file is updated. And as a result of that medical file transaction, then somebody needs to verify my insurance policy. But my insurance policy is a smart contract managed on Ethereum. And there's a set of criteria that says, well, if these things are true, then I'll pay out your premium on this insurance policy. So now I need a message to be able to go from private network of hospitals into public Ethereum network in a very seamless and non-centralized way. So this is the type of cross-blockchain hybrid public and private use case that we think is going to start to become a lot more meaningful in the industry in the next few years, as we see more and more adoption from enterprises and more collusion between public and private networks. And if you've been in the conversations with enterprises recently, you'll probably find that on large numbers, these enterprises are more and more interested in the public networks that they were terrified about 2 years ago. You're seeing more and more banks looking at these as investment opportunities, more and more stock exchanges and commodities exchanges looking at Bitcoin as a potential asset class that they want to support. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange is a good example of that. So we're going to see that a lot more of these collusions are going to start happening. And in what the next layer of infrastructure that needs to be solved for is how do you move these proofs and these value transfers between them. Finally, we see this as an interesting solution for existing public networks. If you are a fan or a holder of a CryptoKitty, you probably know that any one application can have significant negative effects on a public blockchain. So there are needs to scale existing public infrastructures with kind of off-chain or separate chain solutions. Little bit of snapshot into our roadmap. We just released kind of our phase 1 implementation. So again, if you're a developer, we encourage you to kind of take a look at what we're building on GitHub. But we're working on about another 2 years of established roadmap and then kind of more research being done on what we do after that. Aion's being managed kind of as a software foundation. We're primarily headquartered in Toronto, where most of our team is, but we now have an increasing number of people around the world. Our vision of what the future of this industry looks like is really that this is the opportunity that we missed 20 years ago in creating a decentralized internet. And what that means for us is that all of these decentralized technologies that we're all talking about are independently extremely valuable, but together significantly more valuable. But nobody has really solved or cracked that nut of how do you bring all these things together to create the decentralized internet of the future. And blockchains are just kind of a functional building block of what that decentralized internet is going to look like. And connecting those blockchains is a critical path item that we need to solve for. So that's kind of the mission and focus of Aion for now.
Thank you, Matt. I think we're going to have to move on, but thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you.